Jack Shabrowski here, talking about branding elements. Of course, branding elements are the visual and verbal aspects that define a brand and differentiate it from the competitors. The idea behind all of the branding elements is to create a cohesive and recognizable image for a business. Hopefully, that image helps shape how customers perceive and interact with it. Branding elements encompass both tangible and intangible aspects that contribute to the brand's overall identity and positioning. So let's start with branding elements, brand names. Brand names should be simple, easy to pronounce, and easy to spell. Hopefully, we can come up with a brand name that uses familiar words and sounds and implies in a meaningful way the benefits associated with the product. Here is a really good example. Frozen food company brand named Healthy Choice, which of course pitches itself as being a healthy alternative in the frozen food section of the grocery store as opposed to other choices in the frozen food aisle. It helps if the name is different and distinctive or unusual. Um, uh, and here I have a distinct and unusual uh, brand logo, but it is tied to the name UNLV. UNLV outside the business school has a giant sign that says UNLV, daring, different, and diverse. This is sort of a catchy slogan, but it's also a little bit unusual for a university. And of course, the brand name hopefully supports the brand's associations. That is, the things that the brand associates with itself. In the case of our Healthy Choice food alternative, it's brand associations associated with healthful eating. We do want to be careful when you're using fictitious names or computer generated names, and we will discuss that in a future um, lecture. The next branding elements are logos and symbols. And of course, here I have some examples of well known logos and symbols: Pepsi, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King, Harvard, NASA, Apple, Google. On the other side, we have the Chevrolet bow tie. We have the Olympic rings. We have McDonald's Golden Arches. And we have Audi. And then we also have Shell Motor Oil Company and the Texaco Motor Oil Company. Now, a couple of things about logos and symbols. They ought to be meaningful. They ought to be easy to to recognize. They ought to be unique so you don't confuse them with any other company's logos, and they ought to be tied to the name. Of course, we obviously have some here that are clearly tied logos that are clearly tied to the name. Apple, of course, is a good one. Um, the Shell Oil Company, of course, is a shell in yellow and red. And even the Texaco logo is easily tied to the Texaco name. It, and of course, you might notice when you look at that logo that Texaco used to use a jingle that went with that logo, and the jingle was, "You can trust your car to the man who wears the star, the big, bright Texaco star." And so now you can see how that logo was tied to the jingle and tied to the name Texaco. The next branding element is slogans and jingles. And of course, slogans and jingles are similar to the idea of symbols, but these, of course, are both both visual and auditory branding elements. They also should be memorable and meaningful. That is tied to the brand's um, benefits offered, and purpose. They ought to be easy to say, and they ought to sound and look good. That is, they ought to maybe be poetic and rhythmic. Nike, just do it. Coca-Cola, open happiness. We would probably say Coca-Cola, the real thing. Walmart, save money, live better. FedEx, the world on time. Disneyland, the happiest place on earth. Allstate, you're in good hands. And of course, your favorite and mine, McDonald's. I'm loving it. Once again, memorable, meaningful, easy to say, and rhythmic. Another aspect of branding elements is something called trade dress. And trade dress is all of the things that reflect the brand's image. And they can be such things as the font that is used on things. It could be the decor of their retail stores. It could be packaging. It could be store layout. It typically has to do with the colors associated with the logo and with the brand and potentially even with the stores. So when we talk about trade dress, we're talking about all those things that help make a particular brand logo and potentially slogans fit together in a unique way. Here we have the old Taco Bell logo and trade dress, and on the bottom we have the new Taco Bell logo and trade dress. Trade dress ought to be unique. It ought to be easy to recognize and separate enough from other brands so there is no confusion. And of course, it ought to logically tie to the brand. The next branding element are characters and mascots. And of course, you note here we have some of all of our favorites: Captain Crunch, the Jolly Green Giant, the M&Ms, the Michelin Man, Tony the Tiger, Snap, Crackle, and Pop from Kellogg's cereal, the Quaker Oats person, and of course the Keebler Elf. And on the very far left is a mascot that perhaps many of you are not familiar with. It was from the original minor league hockey team in Las Vegas called the Las Vegas Thunder, and their mascot was a skating polar bear named Boom Boom. And of course, you can see how Boom Boom is tied into Thunder. Other branding elements, spokespersons. Think about different spokespersons that we might have for a particular product. In general, we want spokespersons that are likable, easy to recognize, credible, and persuasive. And then another branding element, of course, is packaging. Packaging includes all the things associated with the packaging: the shape of the packaging, the color of the packaging, and of course the writing and imagery on the packaging. All right, and so packaging helps us to identify the brand. It might help by promoting the unique sales proposition on the packaging. The packaging ought to be informative. It ought to be meaningful. That is, it ought to convey what the brand stands for. And of course, in theory, it should be tied to the name. The final branding element that we like to discuss is something called the other assets. And that's all the other things that help create the brand. It could be a number of different aspects that help create the brand's identity and create unique perception in the minds of consumers. Example of brand assets that would include not only the logos, but color palette, perhaps part of trade dress, fonts, taglines, and of course sounds and jingles, and maybe even background music for a particular brand. There are certain brands that when you hear music played, you immediately tie that music to that particular brand. All right, the first choice criteria, of course, would be memorability. That is, every brand element should be easily recognized and easily remembered and easily tied to our brand and no other brands. Second brand element choice criteria would be meaningfulness. When we talk about meaningfulness, what we're talking about is that the brand elements help to identify the brand's benefits offered, the brand's mission, and the brand's selling points. Transferability deals with the ability to take these brand elements and transfer them across categories and even geographical boundaries. And so what we really want are brand elements that work globally at some point in time. We also want brand elements and choice criteria that are adaptable. That is, that they are flexible over time and they are updatable. The example I have here is Pizza Hut. After Pizza Hut got started and was going for a while, Pizza Hut started selling pastas and other Italian foods along with pizza at Pizza Huts. But they eventually had a problem because they're not Italian Hut, they're Pizza Hut. And they were never able to actually move into the other Italian food businesses like they wanted to because they had created this very powerful brand name, Pizza Hut, and Pizza Hut means pizza. So we want something that is adaptable over time. We want a brand element choice criteria that's protectable, that is legally protectable, legally protectable, and legally and competitively protectable. That is, we want our elements to be we need to have the ability to take our elements and not let other people use things that look like this. The example would be, of course, from um, um, Coming to America, where there was a McDonald's. Obviously, it was McDonald's franchises, but the person in the movie had he didn't have a McDonald's franchise. He had a McDowell's franchise, and of course McDonald's had golden arches. He had golden arcs, and of course the thing goes on and on and on. We need to be able to protect our brand elements from other competitors. In summary, we need to focus on the brand. The brand is the business. We need to build a brand, we need to build brand equity, and we need to manage the brands over time. To do that, we use brand elements. And of course, one of the things that we will preach again and again is consistency is critical. Tying all the brand elements together in a way that solidifies our brand is the best thing that we can do.